Dentists are not well-adjusted people. We're all trauma bonded through a universally bad schooling experience. Every instructor had a few screws loose. The biggest psychos I know are pediatric dentists. To sign up voluntarily for a job that deals with crying kids all day? Come on, what's wrong with you? But did you know, the best and brightest of us recommend gargling with your own pee every day? No? I'm Dr. Bitmao. Welcome to the dental history that nobody taught you. Introducing Pierre Fauchard, the man who founded modern dentistry. This man recommended gargling with your own pee every day. Before Pierre, dentistry wasn't a profession. It was a trade performed by barbers, blacksmiths, and traveling showmen at market fairs. If you needed a tooth out, you found whoever had the pliers. Pierre Fauchard changed every single thing about that. He was born in 1678 in Brittany, France. At age 14, he joined the French Royal Navy as a cadet, where he came under the influence of a surgeon who had a deep interest in diseases of the mouth. Fauchard spent 3 years at sea, watching sailors lose their teeth to scurvy and rot, while nobody, not one person in European medicine, had a coherent understanding of why. He left the Navy at 17 with one obsession: understanding the mouth. He moved to Paris in 1718. When he got to Paris and walked into the libraries, he found virtually nothing. No textbooks on dentistry, no systematic descriptions of disease, treatment, or techniques. So he decided to write the book for himself. It took him 10 years. He drew on decades of clinical notes from his own practice. The first manuscript was 600 pages. He kept revising. By the time it was published in 1728, called The Surgeon Dentist, it ran to 783 pages across 2 volumes, with 42 engraved plates showing instruments and procedures. It was the first comprehensive scientific textbook of dentistry in human history. He described tooth anatomy, he described cavities, their formation, and their treatment. He described gum disease. He designed and described the first dental drill, powered by a catgut thread wrapped around the cylinder, turned by hand. He also designed the concept of a dentist chair with a built-in light source. Before Fauchard, nobody had put any of this together in one place. He didn't just write a book, he invented the discipline. Fauchard was one of the first people to identify sugar as a primary cause of tooth decay. In 1728, before anyone had a coherent theory of bacterial acid production. He observed it clinically. Patients who ate more sugar had more cavities. He wrote it down. And here's where it gets interesting. Because of the sugar, he recommended that patients gargle daily with their own urine, fresh urine, every day. He couldn't identify the chemistry behind it, but he observed that it seemed to have beneficial effects on early dental decay. The mechanism, we know now, was the ammonia in urine, a base that temporarily neutralized the acid-damaging enamel. He was right for chemically defensible reasons. He just couldn't explain why. He died in Paris in 1761, at age 83. His book wasn't translated into English until 1946, 218 years after publication. The English-speaking world spent 2 centuries performing dentistry without reading the foundational textbook of the profession. I, for one, am glad we didn't. Otherwise, I might know how my own pee tastes like. The next dude got addicted to chloroform and died in jail after throwing sulfuric acid on women. Introducing Horace Wells, possibly the most tragic figure in medical history. Horace Wells was born in 1815 in Hartford, Vermont. By his late 20s, he was a practicing dentist with a successful practice and a wife named Elizabeth. He had a specific obsession. He was convinced there had to be a way to eliminate pain during dental procedures. He didn't know how yet, he just knew it was possible. On December 10, 1844, he and his wife attended a public exhibition by a showman named Gardner Quincy Colton. The advertisement read, "A grand exhibition of effects produced by inhaling laughing gas." It was entertainment. Colton invited volunteers to inhale nitrous oxide and perform for an audience while intoxicated. One of those volunteers that evening was a young apothecary clerk named Samuel Cooley, Cooley inhaled the gas and became overly intoxicated. He was giddy, running around the stage, and ran directly into a wooden bench, badly bruising his leg. Wells watched. When the effects of the gas wore off, Cooley had no idea he was hurt. None. Wells asked him directly, "Did you feel any pain when you hit the bench?" Cooley said no. He hadn't even noticed the injury. The room kept laughing. Wells sat completely still. The following morning, he called Colton to his office. He arranged for his colleague John Riggs to be present. He had Colton administer the nitrous oxide gas, while Riggs extracted one of Wells' own wisdom teeth. When he was done, he reportedly exclaimed, "It is the greatest discovery ever made. I didn't feel as much as the prick of a pin." He discovered surgical anesthesia because he watched someone run to a bench at a comedy show. He spent the next several weeks using nitrous oxide on his patients with great success. People across Vermont were receiving sedated dentistry, while the rest of the world was still screaming in chairs. Time to go mainstream. He had one of his former students and business partners arrange a demonstration in Boston for the medical community. That student's name was William Morton. Side note, William Morton was a jerk. He tried to steal Wells' discovery and patent it. Back to the main story. The demonstration was supposed to be straightforward. Wells had a patient agree to have a tooth extracted under nitrous in front of his colleagues. It was a disaster. The patient was screaming in the chair. Whether he didn't receive enough or he was simply crying out from the disorientation, the audience heard screaming and concluded the whole thing was a fraud. Wells was booed. He was laughed off the stage. The Boston medical establishment declared it a humbug affair. He returned home devastated. He dissolved his practice. Morton, his former student, went on to develop other anesthesia and successfully demonstrated it to thunderous applause. The discovery that Wells had made 2 years earlier, which Morton had watched fail, was now being attributed to someone else. In the stress and grief of watching his discovery be taken, Wells began self-experimenting with new chemical agents. He was inhaling chloroform regularly. Chloroform is neurotoxic with repeated exposure. His wife described a radical transformation in his personality. He was becoming increasingly erratic, impulsive, and delusional. Wells was destroying his own mind, one inhalation at a time. By January 1848, he had moved to New York City alone, leaving Elizabeth and her son back home. On the morning of January 21st, 1848, on his 33rd birthday, under the influence of chloroform, Horace Wells walked out of his house and threw sulfuric acid at 2 women on the street. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Tombs, New York City's infamous house of detention. When the chloroform wore off and he understood what had happened, he was done. He wrote a final letter to his wife. He begged forgiveness from God and from Elizabeth. He managed to get chloroform smuggled into a cell with his toiletries. He administered it to himself, and while anesthetized the way he always wanted his patients to be, he cut his left femoral artery with a razor. A guard found him dead the following morning. He was 33 years old. Tragic, but it gets even worse. He didn't know. Nobody told him. He died in a prison cell while a foreign medical society was voted to give him the recognition he had spent the last 4 years of his life desperately trying to obtain. The American Dental Association formally recognized Wells as the discoverer of anesthesia in 1864. The American Medical Association followed in 1870. Horace Wells never heard either of those things. He died 3 days after his arrest in a cell in New York at age 33 with the razor in his hand and the smell of chloroform in the air. Before he took his own life, he quietly helped other dentists learn to use nitrous oxide, sharing the technique for free, never seeking a patent, because he believed that freedom from pain should be as free as the air we breathe. He gave away one of the greatest medical discoveries of the 19th century and died in prison for it. Wells may have died a hero, maybe not as much of a hero as the next guy, who you probably know. If you're liking my content so far, please like, subscribe, and comment. It helps me grow my channel. And you get my sincere appreciation for sharing the same curiosity as I do. You may have heard of Paul Revere, the Midnight Riot, the Lanterns, the British are coming, Revolutionary War hero, American legend. What almost nobody knows is that the man who warned the colonists was also a working dentist. Here's how he got into dentistry. By 1768, Paul Revere was 33 years old with a large family, significant debts, and creditors threatening to take his house. He was a trained silversmith and engraver, brilliant with fine metalwork. He needed money. A friend named John Baker, a surgeon dentist practicing in Boston, showed him how to wire artificial teeth made from ivory and animal bone into patients' mouths. He was a dentist not because he dreamed of it, he was a dentist because he needed money. Sounds familiar. One of his regular patients was a physician named Joseph Warren, a founding father, the man who organized the Sons of Liberty's intelligence network. And the man who on the night of April 18, 1775, sent Paul Revere and William Dawes on their famous Midnight Riot to warn the colonies that the British were coming. 2 months later, at the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, Joseph Warren was shot in the head by a British musket ball. He was 34 years old. The British buried him in a shallow mass grave outside Boston without identification. 9 months later, after the British evacuated Boston, Warren's family and friends, including Revere, went to the battlefield to find the body. What they found was a mass of decomposed remains. Visual identification was impossible. Except that Revere had made Warren a dental prosthetic, an artificial bridge replacing his upper left canine to his first premolar, crafted from ivory and wired to the jaw with gold. He recognized his own work immediately. It was the first recorded forensic dental identification in history. The entire modern field of forensic odontology, used today in disaster victim identification, war crimes investigation, and criminal cases worldwide, traces its origin to a silversmith who became a dentist because he needed money. Speaking of money, the next guy accidentally created a multi-billion-dollar industry because he wanted to save time. Alfred Fones didn't set out to transform dentistry. He set out to save time. In 1905, Fones was a practicing dentist in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He spent enormous amounts of his clinical day on routine cleaning appointments. He had patients waiting for other work, and to him, the cleanings were in the way. He looked at his cousin, Irene Newman. She was a recently divorced mother who needed a way to support herself and her son. He sat her down in his dental chair and spent several weeks teaching her how to clean teeth, how to scale, polish, chart, educate patients on home care. He trained her in his own operatory. There were no schools for this. There was no profession for this. He made it up as he went. Irene Newman became the first dental hygienist in history, not because anyone planned it, because Alfred Fones needed to clear his schedule. He eventually recognized what he had stumbled into. In 1913, he opened the Fones School of Dental Hygiene in Bridgeport, the first dental hygiene school in the world. The first class was 27 women. They trained in what was essentially his converted garage. He championed school-based hygiene programs, trained public health advocates, and spent the rest of his career building the profession he had created by accident. Today, there are over 220,000 registered dental hygienists in the United States alone. The dental hygiene profession generates approximately $15 billion annually in the States. He didn't intend to create a recurring revenue model. He was trying to free up his afternoon schedule. He died in 1938. His cousin Irene, who he had trained in his dental chair as a practical convenience, is the foundational figure of an entire health profession. If you're wondering about the gender imbalance in dental hygiene, the profession was constitutionally restricted to women for half a century. The word female was not removed from the AHDA's constitution until 1964. The reason? The dental hygienist role was conceived from the beginning to be a lower paid auxiliary labor. For whatever reason, They thought they'd restrict lower paid roles to women only, and you see the downstream effects of that today. The next guy literally gave up his life to advance the profession. Charles Edmund Kells was born in New Orleans in 1856. His father was a dentist. His mother died when he was 4 years old. He apprenticed in his father's practice as a teenager and studied dentistry at the New York College of Dentistry, graduating in 1878. While studying in New York, he spent his free time at Thomas Edison's Menlo Park Laboratory in New Jersey. Electricity fascinated him more than almost anything else. He came back to New Orleans thinking about electricity constantly. In 1886, when New Orleans began electrifying its streetlights, Kells tapped into the city's power grid and wired his own dental office, becoming the first dentist in the United States to run an electrically powered practice. From there, the inventions came streaming in for the next 30 years. An electric suction apparatus for removing blood and saliva during procedures, still used in every dental and surgical operatory worldwide. A fire extinguisher, an electromagnetic clock, an automobile starter, a drinking fountain, over 30 patents in total. And then, in November 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen announced the discovery of X-rays. Kells built his own X-ray apparatus. In July 1896, he gave the first demonstration of dental X-rays in America to the Southern Dental Association in Asheville, North Carolina. The moment he began his presentation, word spread through the entire hotel. Guests swarmed the room. Everyone wanted to see the bones in their hands. There was a problem that nobody understood yet. To take each X-ray, someone had to hold the film inside the patient's mouth for the entire exposure. The exposure time was 15 to 30 minutes. Kells held the film himself. Patient after patient, procedure after procedure, his hand in the beam for 15 to 30 minutes at a time. He did this hundreds of times. Nobody knew about radiation protection. The concept didn't exist. In 1908, 12 years after his first X-ray demonstration, Kells noticed a small lesion in his left thumb that wouldn't heal. He went to Johns Hopkins for surgery. It was the first of 35 operations. The lesions multiplied across his hand. Fingers were amputated one at a time. Then the thumb, then the hand. Then in 1926, his 35th operation removed his left arm at the shoulder. Through all of it, he kept working. He crafted dental instruments with attachments to fit what remained of his hand. He kept inventing, he kept writing. By 1928, the cancer was spreading to his right arm. He was losing his eyesight. He was in pain. He wrote that he was worried about becoming dependent on others. On May 7, 1928, two of his dental assistants found him lying on a couch in the private office of his clinic. He shot himself. He was 71 years old. He had practiced dentistry in New Orleans for 50 years. In the same year that Charles Edmund Kells died, the first international X-ray safety guidelines were adopted by the International Congress of Radiology. The protective equipment that every dental patient wears today, the lead apron, the thyroid collar, the 2-second digital sensor that replaced the 15-minute film exposure, none of it existed when Kells was holding his hand in the beam. He was one of the many X-ray martyrs of his era. He's considered the father of dental radiology. The book he finished while dying was never published. And that's a wrap. 5 people. A French Navy cadet who invented an entire profession and prescribed urine. A Vermont dentist who discovered dental anesthesia, gave it away for free, and died in a prison cell 12 days before the world recognized him. A patriot dentist who solved a murder with a gold wire. A Connecticut dentist who accidentally created a $1 billion recurring revenue model while trying to save time. A New Orleans inventor who brought diagnostic radiation in dentistry and was killed by it one finger at a time. The dental profession as you know it was built by people like these. Geniuses and frauds, martyrs and thieves. Visionaries whose best ideas were ignored and whose worst ideas were taught in dental schools for a century. Understanding where it came from is the first step to understanding what it still gets wrong. Check out taprootdental.com if you want a former dentist in your corner who knows his history and reads the current evidence. Like, subscribe, drop a comment. Until next time, peace out.